So when you talk about the election of 1968, we'll talk about the Democratic Party first. Now, probably the two most important Democratic political figures were out of the picture by the time the election of 1968 came about. President Johnson was out of the picture. He could have run for re-election, but he all of a sudden is out of the picture because the Vietnam War ruined him. Okay? So he's out of the picture. So we're going to talk about the two most prestigious or most important political figures that people were counting on to maybe be in the presidential race are going to be out of this. Johnson, first of all, the Vietnam War ended his political career. Who is the other person that's out of the race? Robert Kennedy. What happened to him? He was assassinated. So the Democratic Party is kind of in shambles to a point when they're trying to figure out who their candidate's going to be before they go to convention. So again, the two very important Democratic political figures were out of the picture. Lyndon Johnson was ruined, his political career ruined by the Vietnam War, and Robert Kennedy, an assassin, ended his life. But there would be three men that would be seeking the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. Now we talked about one who threw in early against Lyndon Johnson before he decided not to run for re-election, the senator from Minnesota. Anybody remember who that was? Anybody do a report on him? Clean Gene. That's what his nickname was. He first came in and he got the younger people interested, and when Kennedy saw his success against Johnson, then he decided to throw in Eugene McCarthy. Okay? So Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota is going to continue his efforts for the Democratic nomination. He never really got out. Robert Kennedy just got in and became the automatic front runner. And because of the pressure of Kennedy's and the Vietnam War is why Lyndon Johnson decided not to run. Now another person that's going to get into this race from a smaller state was a senator from South Dakota, George McGovern. George McGovern decided he would seek the Democratic nomination. George McGovern of South Dakota. Now, he was a big Kennedy advocate, so he basically got into the presidential race to try to keep the Kennedy forces together. He thought he could get support from the Kennedy forces. So you've got Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, who is continuing his quest for the nomination. You've got Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, who really entered the political race because he wanted to keep the Kennedy forces together. He thought he could receive the support of those that had supported Robert Kennedy. And the third person is someone we kind of forget about because we were so enamored by Lyndon Johnson, what he was doing. Who else might throw their hat in the ring? The VP, anybody remember who that would be? Hubert Humphrey. So the third possible Democratic nominee in the election of 1968 was Hubert H. Humphrey, who was the vice president. So you've got Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, and you have Vice President Hubert Humphrey, all trying to gain that nomination. Well, that'll take us to an interesting time in history, and that was the Democratic National Convention of 1968. The Democratic National Convention. Now, we talked about how the conventions worked, and we talked about how Kennedy was nominated in the first ballot when Wyoming gave him their delegate votes. Well, the Democratic National Convention in '68 would be in Chicago, and it would be in August of 1968. So the Democratic National Convention, which will choose their nominee, was held in Chicago in August of 1968. And this convention is going to be an incredibly violent scene. One of the most violent scenes in America's history. It's going to be a very negative scene in America. Now, what are people going to go to the convention to protest against? The Vietnam War and what we call the establishment. What's the establishment? People in power in the government. So what's going to happen at this convention that we haven't seen at conventions is different groups are going to show up to protest the Vietnam War and protest the establishment, which is which party? The Democratic Party. Okay, that's why we're having such a mess here. Now, two specific groups that went to the Democratic National Convention to highlight their opposition to both the Vietnam War and the establishment's values. One was the National Mobilization to end the war in Vietnam. That was the name of their group. The National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, more commonly known as MOBI. Okay? So the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam is a group of people that were opposed to the Vietnam War and the establishment values. And the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam group, also known as MOBI, was there protesting. Okay, you also had the Youth International Party, better known as what? Yippies, not hippies, but yippies. The Youth International Party, who referred to themselves as yippies, and they were led by Abby Hoffman. Abby Hoffman. So we got the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam group, called MOBI there. You've got the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, led by Abby Hoffman there. And they're all there to protest either the Vietnam War or establishment values or both. What other groups might be there to express their concern on the candidate that we've talked about? Well, not so much the hippies. Talk about maybe a little bit, one violent, one non-violent. What might be another organization that might be there? If you watched Forrest Gump, they were at the March on Washington. What party? The Black Panther Party. Okay, or the Black Panthers were there. Okay, they were there to make sure what was assured at the Democratic National Convention? Equal rights, civil rights. Who else might be there to make sure civil rights was represented that was of a non-violent nature? SCLC. So you have all kinds of groups. You got MOBI, you got the Yippies, you got the Black Panthers, you got the SCLC, and you're going to have other types of groups that are going to be there. And who is nervous about this? Who would be the most nervous about the Democratic Convention in Chicago? We talked about this guy before. What's that? Not him, but we might have been nervous, but whose city is it? Richard Daley. Very good. Mayor Daley. And he was nervous because you want to have a Democratic or Republican National Convention in your city. Why would you want that? It's like you want a Super Bowl. Brings in people, brings in attention, brings in good publicity. Well, he got pretty nervous because he thought the way that the city of Chicago might be promoted would be in a negative manner. So what do you think Mayor Daley did? I'm going to tell you two things he did to try and make sure that the city got a good rep on this thing. What might he do? Considering the circumstances. What might he do? What could he see maybe was going to happen? Trouble? So what might he do to prevent trouble? He did. Number one, he placed Chicago's 12,000 police officers on 12-hour shifts. So he placed the entire Chicago Police Department, which was about 12,000, on 12-hour shifts to help curb any violence. Now, what did Kennedy finally figure out after a couple of times he got burnt on civil rights riots? What did he do in advance? Right, and that's what Daley did. He brought in 7,500 Army troops and 6,000 National Guardsmen into Chicago to make sure that things didn't get out of hand. So with these different radical groups in Chicago for the convention, Mayor Daley took action by doing two things. He placed Chicago's 12,000 police officers on 12-hour shifts, and he welcomed the arrival of 7,500 Army troops and 6,000 National Guardsmen to Chicago to keep things in order. Well, this thing got kind of crazy. The crowds gathered, became very disorderly throughout the convention. Violence broke out all over the place. And the Chicago Police Department stepped in when they believed that the demonstrations had gotten out of hand, and it just got to be a mess. They were beating protesters, similar to what you saw in the civil rights issues that we talked about earlier, only they weren't just black people getting beat, they were black and white and every different group and organization possible. So the crowd started to gather. They became very disorderly throughout the convention. Police stepped in, and they, in their attempt to arrest protesters, beat them up pretty good. And the crowd began to shout, The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching. Because how is the whole world watching? TV. All of this civil unrest was shown nightly during the convention, and I'm going to show you a video of it tomorrow to kind of show you what it looked like. And it got so crazy that someone by the name of Todd Gitlin actually wrote a book called The Whole World is Watching, talking about all the violence at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. It was a mess, and you'll see video of it tomorrow. It was absolutely a mess. And all of this mess was shown on national television nightly by the media. Well, when they got all done with the convention, guess who got the nomination of those three? Anybody want to guess? You wouldn't think so, because everybody's there to go against the establishment. Hubert Humphrey. So in the end, the establishment candidate had won. Vice President Humphrey was nominated for president on the first ballot, surprisingly. And then he chose a senator from Maine by the name of Edmund S. Muskie as his running mate. So when the dust cleared at the Democratic National Convention, the establishment candidate won the nomination. Vice President Hubert Humphrey was nominated for president on the first ballot, and then he chose Senator Edmund S. Muskie of Maine to be his running mate. And that tells you about the Democratic Party and where we're at on a candidate. Okay? Any questions at all on any of that? Okay, let's move to the Republican Party. Tell you how they did. Their convention was in Miami Beach, Florida. Their convention was in Miami Beach, Florida, and much more user-friendly, so to speak. And three candidates emerged for the Republican nomination for president as well. Three candidates. We've talked about two of them. Anybody want to take a guess? One always acted like he wanted to run, mainly to make sure things within his own platform. Well, Richard Nixon, former Vice President Nixon's going to run. Okay, he got defeated by who in 1960? JFK. And he didn't try to run in 64. He was mad and went home to California, and we'll talk about that later. So former Vice President Nixon is going to come back and try to win in 68. Who was the guy that ran against Nixon for the Republican nomination in 60, and they had to compromise? Nelson Rockefeller. So Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York was also a possible candidate. And Taylor Fulfer, what other governor of California threw his name in the race? Ronald Reagan. So when the Republican convention assembled in Miami Beach, Florida, the following three candidates were in the race for nomination. Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, former Vice President Richard Nixon, who had lost to John Kennedy in 1960, and Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Obviously, who was nominated on the first ballot? Nixon. And then he chose... No, not yet. Nixon, or we'd be talking about the presidency of Ronald Reagan, which we may. Anyway, Nixon was nominated on the first ballot, and he chose the governor of Maryland, Spiro T. Agnew, as his running mate. So Nixon wins the Republican nomination on the first ballot, and then chooses governor of Maryland, Spiro T. Agnew, as his running mate. So in the election of 1968, you're going to have, for the Democrats, Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey and Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine against former Vice President Richard Nixon and Maryland Governor Spiro T. Agnew. And that'll take us to the campaign. And what do you do when you have a campaign? You have major campaign issues, right? You have major campaign issues. In this particular election, there were three major campaign issues. And we should be able to get two of them. I know we've been kind of lax in here. What are the campaign issues? What's one? What? Vietnam War. Vietnam War. And then they did a poll prior to this election, and 66% of Americans believed the war in Vietnam was being badly managed. 66% of Americans believed that the war in Vietnam was being badly managed. That would certainly make it a campaign issue. What might be another campaign issue that we've had as a campaign issue every campaign?
Civil rights.
Civil rights. Very good. And you got a kind of a weird deal there. A majority of white citizens believed that the civil rights struggle was going too fast, and a majority of black citizens were convinced that it was not going fast enough. So it was certainly still a campaign issue on equal rights for blacks. What do you think else might have been a topic that we've talked about, especially what happened in the convention at Chicago? What's this country losing track of? What's going on? Violence and disorder was another big campaign topic. Everybody thought this country was going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, we had violence all over the country in the 60s, political assassinations, beating of civil rights people, beating of protesters at the 68 convention. You got protests at the 1968 Summer Olympic Games. So just the country's out of control. So violence and disorder was another campaign issue. And statistically, 70% of Americans were convinced that law and order had completely broken down in the United States prior to this election. 70% of Americans prior to the election of 1968 believed that law and order had completely broken down in our country, that we had no semblance of law and order. Now, to be honest with you, at the early stages of this presidential campaign, neither Nixon nor Humphrey had much enthusiasm among the American people. And what happens when nobody's really too happy about the two that are running?
Third party jumps in.
You get a third party, and that's what happens. The American Independent Party comes into being. And guess who they nominate? An old guy that, no, not that far back, but somebody that wasn't real popular in the civil rights movement.
Oh, there it was. Very cool.
There will be segregation in Alabama today, tomorrow, and forever. George Wallace. So the American Independent Party nominated Alabama Governor George Wallace for the presidency. Now, Governor Wallace knew he didn't have a chance to win, but thought he could win. Now, I don't know if you know where you're at in your government class, but what happens in a political election if we vote and nobody gets 2/3 majority electoral votes? What happens? They go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will decide the presidency. That's happened. Happened in 1824 with Andrew Jackson. Took a big loss because of that. He just got ripped off, and then the guy that won put a friend of his in as Secretary of State, and it was a corrupt bargain. Some of you remember that from last year. Well, Wallace really believed that if he jumped in the race, he could keep both Nixon and Humphrey from getting 2/3 of the electoral votes. And he thought if it went to the House of Representatives that he would win. He thought he had enough support. So that was Wallace's goal, to try to keep both Humphrey and Nixon from gaining the majority vote. That would result in the House of Representatives deciding the presidency. And Wallace really did believe that he had enough support, especially in the South, that he could win the presidency. Okay? So, that'll take us to the candidates and their views on those three major campaign issues. And we'll start with George Wallace. See how he handled the three campaign issues we talked about: violence and disorder, the Vietnam War, and civil rights. We'll see what his philosophy on that was. Okay? Which of those three do you think he really hammered that we had the biggest problem in? Surprisingly, it wasn't civil rights. No? Law and order. He hammered at the fact that law and order in this country is totally out of control because we're trying to give those Negroes their rights. We're having all these protesters in the Vietnam War. So he hammered at the issue of law and order.
Who did?
Wallace. He also hated existing welfare programs. Hated that. Hated existing welfare programs. Who's he pointing the finger at there?
Blacks.
Blacks mainly, and then low-income whites. He also opposes integration, does he not? So that's how his view on civil rights was. He opposes integration, and he opposes all existing welfare programs. Sewed up the black vote, didn't he? But he hammered at law and order and said if he was elected that he would get the country back in shape. As far as Vietnam, he promised to end the war by negotiation. He promised to end the Vietnam War by negotiation. However, if negotiations failed, a military victory would be necessary. So he's going to try to negotiate, and if it doesn't work, we're going to do what? Continue to fight. Okay? So as far as his view on Vietnam, he promises to end the Vietnam War by negotiation, but states clearly that if negotiation doesn't work, we will have to have a military victory, which meant probably committing 2,000, 6,000 more troops to Vietnam. How about Nixon? What did he think? What did he kind of ignore of the three? What? Civil rights. Yeah. He basically, instead of talking about civil rights, he just stated that we need new leadership. It's time for a change. So he kind of skirts the issue of civil rights. Eisenhower didn't have a very good reputation on civil rights. He was stand patism. He didn't do anything for it or against, and he was kind of the same way. So he didn't say much about civil rights. He just stated it's time for new leadership. It's time for a change. As far as law and order, he promised, maybe not as directly as Wallace, but he promised to restore law and order in the United States. He recognized that was a problem and said he would restore it. And as far as Vietnam, he said he would promise to end the war by negotiation. And he actually said he would, quote, bring an honorable end to the Vietnam War. That was his big quote. He said he would bring an honorable end to the Vietnam War. But he didn't say how he would do it. Why? Why didn't he say how he was going to bring an honorable war? Wallace said he'd try to negotiate, but if negotiation didn't work, we were going in and we were going to win. Nixon didn't say that. He said he would bring an honorable end. Why didn't he say how? Well, what's kind of going on now that we talked about just as Johnson took off?
Well, we know we're probably going to lose it.
Okay, so, you're right. But what started before this election, during the Johnson